The quiet town of Calne in Wiltshire. The 11,000 people here hold a secret important to every other community in Britain. They've been part of a unique study which will concern politicians, doctors, ordinary workers and their families. People like Peter Currell. He feels his life is in ruins. Like Bill Morgan, once an active sportsman, now he can barely tend his garden. Like Les Edwards, the victim of serious illnesses. Like Ian Hiscock, who believes 6 years have been taken off his life. And Jean Clark, a widow whose husband died suddenly, aged only 46.
He came home at lunchtime, got up to go out in the garden, and he'd had a stroke then. He had another stroke again on the Sunday, and he never regained consciousness. After that, he died on the following Thursday.
They have one thing in common. They all worked here, and their experience provides the evidence of something long suspected but never before proven. Dr Norman Beale is a local GP turned investigator. He's carried out research on their health and that of dozens of others over 10 years. His final results, revealed today, provide for the first time overwhelming scientific evidence of an uncomfortable truth. Unemployment can seriously damage your health.
We're not looking here at subtle changes in common, everyday illnesses we all suffer. Unless we're very lucky, any of us will get a sore throat 2 or 3 times a year. We're actually facing changes, increases in long-term illnesses such as heart disease, in men who lose their jobs. Very worrying findings.
I'd suggest for another month, and then we'll see. I mean, if all's well, then.
Here in Calne, Dr Beale has proved something we might think we already know. Common sense tells us redundancy is bound to be costly both for people's health and for the health service. But no one has ever found out how far-reaching the effects are. Dr Beale's work shows that even in a well-to-do part of Britain, the price of recession and unemployment is very high, higher than doctors and politicians might believe.
It's now accepted pretty well by everyone that smoking and lung cancer are strongly linked. But if you go back a generation, even a generation of doctors themselves, it was by no means accepted, and it may be that I shall be retired before any link between unemployment and health is accepted.
Dr Beale's work could make uncomfortable reading in Whitehall, for attempts to persuade successive governments to fund a nationwide study of the hidden health costs of unemployment have come to nothing. Professor Raymond Ilsley, a former member of the Medical Research Council, called for a national study 6 years ago.
If Dr Beale's work were confirmed on a larger scale, it would suggest that the policy that the government has pursued has had very major costs in the health of the population. If his results are correct, and I have no reason whatsoever to doubt them, it has been a major drain on the resources of the health service, coping with the extra load caused by unemployment.
The unlikely starting point for Dr Beale's research was here. This was the site of the biggest bacon factory in Britain. For 2 centuries, Calne was the home of Wiltshire bacon. Royalty visited the Harris bacon factory. Even the Queen's sausages came from here. 2,000 people worked in the factory in its heyday. They expected to leave school and spend all their working lives at Harris's.
My father worked for the bacon company. My grandfather worked in the factory. Then I followed on.
We worked in the factory for 30 years. My husband did. I done 28. My husband's father, grandparents, all worked in the factory.
Your family, your relatives, you knew everybody that was there because it had been there so long. It was the town, in my opinion.
6 years ago, the factory closed. The last 300 workers were made redundant. Dr Beale has studied 10 years in the lives of people who worked here.
The original idea came to me when I was mowing the lawn at home. It suddenly dawned on me, in fact, that we were no longer having to cope with the minor injuries and minor infections among those who worked at Harris's. Now that they had lost their jobs, we were no longer seeing these type of everyday medical problems. And I began to wonder whether that had in fact reduced our daily workload.
His careful study of the health effects of one factory closure is unique and could be important to any one of us.
The essentials of the study were that we were able to compare the health of the Harris workers before and after they had lost jobs. Also, we were able to compare their health with that of an exactly comparable group of other workers in Calne who remained in jobs in other local industries.
He began sifting through the health records of a sample of people who'd worked at Harris's. His first findings came as a surprise.
At first, we just could not make sense of the numbers. There seemed to be no obvious difference in the health of people made redundant when we were comparing simply before and after they had lost their jobs. And then, close to the point of abandoning the whole project, the penny actually dropped.
The doctor had to turn detective before he could make any sense of the mass of facts and figures he'd secretly gathered. And in back issues of the local newspaper, he found the critical clue. The threat of redundancy had been hanging over the Harris workers for 2 years before the factory finally closed down.
No one, I don't think, ever knows where inspiration comes from. We were doing before and after research, yes, but before and after the wrong event. We should really have been looking at and comparing before and after, not job loss, but the threat of job loss, which in Harris's case had been 2 years earlier.
To demonstrate Dr. Beale's findings, we asked 100 of Calne's residents to help us. To tell our story, they become human statistics. The doctor's first important finding was that when the people who used to work here on the old Harris's site were worried about their jobs, they became ill. Dr. Beale discovered a big increase in the number of times some people were coming to his surgery. When worried about their jobs, the number of visits to the doctor by Harris workers went up by nearly a quarter. After they lost their jobs, people continued to see their doctors more often. The increase had previously gone unnoticed, lost in the large numbers of patients seen day to day.
The obvious immediate conclusion was that the threat of redundancy is perhaps even as damaging to health as the event itself. Perhaps in some even more so, particularly if it's a rather extended time, as it was at Harris's, over 2 years, living with this worry and anxiety, was my job or was my job not secure?
Bill Morgan was fit and well over the 30 years he worked as a maintenance engineer at Harris's. He was 47 when he lost his job. Today he's crippled by arthritis and suffers nervous stress.
I was a dead keen sportsman. I mean, I played football and cricket every Saturday of the year. If someone had said to me 10 years ago that this was going to happen, no, I just wouldn't have believed that it would. I think it's just all a build-up from the stress through the uncertainty of the last 2 years. And then, through having to wait to know whether you were going to be made redundant or not, then I became sort of my nerves seemed to go, because I couldn't seem to cope with the fact that I could be out of a job. We were going to have a fairly comfortable life. I'm not going to say we were going to be well off, but we were going to have a comfortable life. But for the last 6 years, we haven't even had a holiday, so that's the sort of position we're in at the moment.
Dr. Beale also secretly scrutinized Ian Hiscock's health. He too fell victim to stress, but only after the factory closed.
I was getting nervous shakes, and I used to go out shopping when I used to go in the supermarkets. I used to start shaking, and I had to get outside quick. My nerves got so bad, and I think it really took about 5 or 6 years off my life. The first 6 months, it wasn't so bad. And then my nerves started getting worse and worse, where you were trying to think where the money was going to come from. I mean, you had to keep all your luxuries at home going. I mean, I had a phone, a car, and you don't get allowances of those things. And worrying about where the next penny was coming from, you know, it made me really ill. In the end, I had to go to the doctors. You know, I was in such a nervous state.
Perhaps those people with very content lives and very content in their jobs as part of those lives were in fact the people who felt they had most to lose. They were the people most traumatized by finding that jobs were no longer secure.
Ian Hiscock is still taking tablets to control the stress he suffered through unemployment, even though he finally found another job.
It's definitely an illness. I mean, you don't realise it until you experience it. You can't sort of tell people what it's like. You explain to people you don't feel well, they look at you and say, well, you look perfectly fit. But inside you're not. And it's it. You can never explain to anybody what it's like.
What would you say to someone who says, well, I don't believe redundancy does that to people?
I say, well, when it comes to you, then you know. That's all I can say. Because I know it's definitely the redundancy that do it.
This is the one that is quite fascinating, isn't it? That's actually gone up so much there.
We've checked all these and ironed out.
To ensure that his research was scientifically sound, Dr. Beale enlisted the help of a statistician, Susan Nethercott, who was experienced in medical research.
That's something like a 5-fold increase, and that it's significant.
We showed their work to Dr. David Player, former director of the Health Education Council, and asked him to evaluate it.
It can't be dismissed because it's statistically significant. It's a properly controlled scientific study. Certainly Dr. Beale would like to do a larger study, and I'd like to see him do one. But as it stands, it cannot be ignored by the government or by fellow scientists.
But the breathing itself, you didn't get into terrible difficulty.
No.
So we might get away without using steroids again.
Dr. Beale's next goal was to try to find out how long the effects of redundancy went on and how serious the resulting illnesses could be. The results were remarkable.
We actually find dramatic rises in the onset of long-term illnesses, sometimes serious illnesses like heart disease, when we compare them with other men who kept their jobs in other secure employment in Calne.
We'll just keep going as we've been doing.
Each of these people represents a case of long-term chronic illness among people who've remained fully employed. The increase in serious long-term illness discovered by Dr. Beale among people made redundant highlights a huge increase in misery for those affected. Men who are unemployed are 6 times as likely to have serious long-term illness than people in work.
Well, obviously, I think that the most significant finding is that there was a major difference over quite a long period of years, going now up to 10 years, in the health of the employees who became redundant compared with the control group. In other words, it's not something which is ephemeral. It's not something that passes overnight. It's got a very long-term effect.
Yes, this is quite fascinating here, that this consultation rate has gone up this much, over 3 times. When the
People, of course, can become ill as they get older. But Dr. Beale's study shows that those who lost their jobs are 6 times more likely to develop serious illness. And the sickness goes far beyond debilitating nervous stress to a range of serious, even life-threatening diseases. Les Edwards was healthy until he was thrown out of work at the age of 54.
Since I was made redundant, my health went down. Then I had a heart attack and a colitis problem, and then I had another bout of heart trouble, and I've been going to the hospital and the doctors ever since. I find doing things, I get tired quick. If I say, for instance, if I went and tried to do a little bit of gardening, where before I could dig my garden, say, in one afternoon, now it would take me probably a week, 10 days, to finish what I would normally do in one day, because I do a little bit and then rest because I get out of breath so quick. With a lot of redundancy, you'd have a lot of illness throughout the country. Like, people in the Midlands or anywhere like that, in the car factories, if one of them factories with thousands working closed down, the frustration, I think, for them people would be terrible. I think they would have more illness there than what we got around here. I feel that I've aged since I was made redundant, aged faster than what I should do, actually. I think that with the stress and strain of trying to find a job and the worry of not having a job, I think that makes you age.
Peter Currell was a lorry driver for Harris's. He was 54 when the factory closed down.
I worked for just over 40 years at Harris's. I hadn't had a day's illness in my life. But since then, I've had chest trouble twice. I have now asthma. I've been left with asthma. I've got arthritis. I've got fibrositis. And I have to take tablets and inhaler all the time now. I'm really a physical wreck. You get that short of breath, you feel that you're going to die, you know. You just think, oh, God, am I going to live to the next day? I mean, the first time I had it, I sat up for 5 nights, afraid to go to bed and lay down in case I didn't get up in the morning.
Did it frighten you?
Frightened, yes. Absolutely. Used to sit here in the sweat.
It may be that the sudden trauma of losing your job, you're having no chance to plan your retirement. It comes early when least expected. And it's an expression, perhaps, of the fact that, although you may have worked in the factory coming up 50 years, really, like anyone else, they suddenly need you no more.
For some, redundancy has ended in tragedy. Jean Clark's husband, Edgar, was 46 when the factory closed.
His personality changed completely. He became very moody, very depressed, and very worried because he couldn't get any work. He went out trying for work every day, but there was not any jobs going because he was 46 years old, and at that age people didn't want to know, they only wanted younger people. But before that he was very happy-go-lucky, and he did change completely.
Just 4 months after the factory closed, Edgar Clark died.
He went out looking for a job on Thursday morning, and he came home, had his lunch, and he got up to go out into the garden to do some jobs to pass the time away. He had a stroke then, and he was taken to hospital. He had another bad stroke again on the Sunday, and he never regained consciousness. He died the following Thursday.
Why do you think he suddenly had that heart attack?
I think it was due to the stress and strain of not being able to get work. And I do really believe that was a lot to do with it.
Over and above the effects that redundancy seems to have on individuals concerned, there are obviously implications for running the health service. The people having lost their jobs, developing a surprisingly large number of long-term illnesses, obviously are consulting us more often.
In Calne, the implications of unemployment for the health service are clear. Dr Beale discovered that the workload for family doctors grew dramatically as people became worried about their jobs and developed serious illnesses. At first, the local doctors were seeing only a small number of workers with serious illnesses. For every 100 patients, there were 23 visits due to chronic illness. But once people became worried about their jobs, the number of visits to the doctor by men seriously ill began to grow. And after they'd lost their jobs, the numbers swelled again to more than 5 times the original rate.
We're treating those illnesses and therefore prescribing more drugs for longer.
Someone working in a secure job will, on average, be prescribed 17 pills a year, enough for about 1 course of antibiotics. For Dr Beale's sample of Harris workers, the average intake of drugs climbed sharply when their jobs were under threat and they developed chronic illness, more than a 3-fold increase. Over the 4 years after the factory closed down, the average consumption of drugs for chronic illness climbed again to 7 times the amount taken by an ordinary worker in a secure job.
We're actually sending many of them to see specialists. And each time we send someone to see a specialist, even the very first visit costs at least something like £120. And the cost implication of that for a creaking health service is very worrying. If one took our findings and put that in the context of the whole country, and no one seems to have done that, then perhaps here we have something, in part at least, to explain why the health service is today proving to be so expensive to run.
Calne has weathered the recession well. Unemployment here has never been high. Some experts fear that Dr Beale's findings here may not reveal the health costs of unemployment across Britain.
We are frequently told by government that unemployment is the cost that we pay for revitalising our economy. I want to know what those costs are. Whilst we may know in a very general sense, we don't know how it affects, we don't know who it affects, we don't know whether the results, if they are results, are reversible. We don't know whether it is only the person employed or whether it's their spouse and their children. All these things, I think, we need to know and ought to know.
The health of the families of those made redundant was also checked in Dr Beale's study. And here he found some of the most worrying evidence. They too became seriously ill.
It is just as with the employees themselves, not a matter of subtle change in minor illnesses. There are clear indications that what any of us would consider to be serious illnesses appearing more often than we would expect among wives and husbands and children of those who lose their jobs.
While Harris's factory has long disappeared, its old social club carries on. Most of the present members worked at Harris's. When Dr Beale began his study into their health, unknown to him, the Royal College of General Practitioners and the Royal College of Psychiatrists urged the government to launch a national investigation. It never happened.
There have been attempts over the last 10 years in this country to raise this issue in the area of public debate by scientists and by physicians. Most of them have not been taken up. The government of the day has been unwilling to put sufficient funds into researching this properly. And most of the work has been done by individual researchers in their own time.
One national study nearly did take place. Professor Ilsley was asked by the Department of Health in 1981 if he would launch it. At the time, he was unable to do so. The following year, he tried to revive the idea.
At first, there was a favourable reaction. The civil servants were certainly favourable. However, no decision seemed to be taken. It meandered on, and eventually I was told, no, it couldn't be done. And whilst the obvious, the overt level was that we all know unemployment's a bad thing, we don't need to know any more about it, we're doing our best. Nevertheless, there was the feeling that if uncomfortable results came out, they would be embarrassing. I can see no reason at all why, having found out what Dr Beale has found out, the department should be at all pleased to go ahead and spend their money to get more of it.
There seems to be...
I feel very strongly that an enormous opportunity has been missed here. All people in this country are registered with a family doctor. There are, on every one of them, therefore, long-standing medical records. And it's basically very simple to go to those records and compare from those records alone, without involving even the individual concerned, their health before and after an event in their lives, such as losing their jobs. It obviously would be much better research, with perhaps much more meaningful findings, if this were to be done on a national scale. And I regret very much that that hasn't seemed to have been done.
The empty space where the bacon factory stood is soon to be redeveloped. Around the river, new houses and businesses will appear, revitalising the centre of Calne. But for some of the people here, their lives have already been damaged beyond repair.
Well, I think it really took about 5 or 6 years off my life. I know it's definitely the redundancy to do it. When it comes to you, then you know.
I feel that I've aged faster than what I should do. The worry of not having a job, I think that makes you age.
He became very depressed with worry, the stress and the strain of not being able to get work. And I think that was a lot to do with the cause of his death.